In the climate-controlled vault beneath London's British Museum, tablet K162 rests in archival darkness. The clay is brittle now, not old in the simple way wood becomes old or paper becomes yellowed, but old in the way matter itself reorganizes over time, 4,000 years of slow molecular decay, turning what was once malleable earth into something closer to stone. Its surface still holds the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, each mark pressed deliberately by a scribe's reed stylus sometime in the 7th century BCE. And yet the words the account the tablet preserves reach further back than the hand that copied them. A later copy of an older memory, a careful duplication of something that already belonged to the deep past, even when this scribe was alive. The tablet is not large. It weighs perhaps 2 pounds. It measures roughly 6 inches across. It is in the most literal sense a small object, and that is part of what makes it unsettling, because according to its text, it documents the moment when 7 divine beings pass judgment on a goddess who has descended into their realm. The tablet calls them the Anunnaki, 7 judges, 7 who decree fate. What strikes you first when you hold the translation in your mind is not the fantasy of it. Ancient texts overflow with gods and monsters' journeys to impossible realms, beings who command storms, voices that reshape mountains. We have learned to read such narratives as mythology, as symbol, as metaphor, as imaginative architecture, cultures building meaning out of forces they could not control. But that is not what strikes you here. What strikes you is the procedural language, the administrative precision, the feeling that you are not reading chaos or whimsy, but a record of jurisdiction. Because the text does not describe the 7 Anunnaki acting on impulse. It describes a council, a tribunal, a formal assembly with authority, power that does not simply erupt, it deliberates. It follows protocol. It renders binding decisions, as though an established law already exists, waiting to be applied. And then the text mentions something else, something that appears again and again across dozens of cuneiform tablets, excavated from cities buried beneath Iraqi desert sand. The Anunnaki are not described as unified, not harmonious, not a single stable pantheon. They are described as divided, factional, sometimes violently opposed to one another. And so the question forms almost on its own before you have decided you believe anything at all. What if we've been reading these tablets wrong? What if the Sumerian scribes were not recording mythology, not in the sense we assume that word means? What if they were preserving the memory of something that to them actually happened, something that fractured the divine order? What if the wars among the Anunnaki, the battles for cosmic authority, the theft of divine tablets, the flood sent to erase humanity, were not separate myths at all, but connected chapters in a single catastrophic story? What if the Anunnaki war was a civil war? Before you dismiss that, just pause with it. Not as belief, not as doctrine, just as a question that refuses to stay silent once it's been asked. Because over the next hours, you will encounter specific tablets with precise catalog numbers housed in specific museums, excavated from specific archaeological sites. You will hear what those tablets say, translated by scholars who have spent their lives learning languages that have been dead for millennia. You will see patterns that emerge when texts are placed side by side, the tensions they document, the conflicts they return to, the repeated emphasis on authority as something contested, not merely possessed. And you will be invited to consider a possibility that mainstream scholarship usually avoids, that the Sumerians were recording, from their perspective, what they believed to be real, not inventing myths, not crafting allegories, but preserving accounts of events they considered historical, a cosmic power struggle among beings they called gods, a conflict so destructive it nearly erased humanity and a civilization built in its aftermath from the wreckage of whatever came before. If you're somewhere you can take a moment quietly without breaking the mood, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. These tablets crossed millennia to reach us. Your presence here now connects you to a question that has haunted humans since we first learned to read wedge-shaped writing pressed into clay. The question is simple. The implications are not. Because if these texts preserve memory rather than myth, then human civilization does not begin with invention. It begins with inheritance. And the beings we were taught to dismiss as imaginary gods might be something else entirely. The vault is dark. The tablet is silent. But the words remain waiting to be read again. So let's begin with the ground itself, with the places these tablets emerged from, with the civilization that left them buried in the earth. The Euphrates River cuts through southern Iraq like a vein of dark water threading through pale desert. 5,000 years ago, this landscape looked different. Marshlands spread between the Tigris and Euphrates, creating a fertile crescent of reed beds and canals, agricultural fields, and shifting waterways. Cities rose on artificial mounds, built up over centuries of habitation, mud brick walls visible for miles across flat terrain. These were the cities of Sumer. Eridu, the southernmost, claimed to be the oldest city on Earth, its ziggurat temple controlling trade routes to the Persian Gulf. Nippur, the central religious sanctuary, served as neutral ground where competing city-states came to resolve disputes. Uruk, Lagash, Kish. Each city maintained its own king, its own patron deity, its own scribal schools, where young men learned to press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, turning speech into record, turning memory into archive. And in those scribal schools, they copied texts, not only administrative records, barley inventories, livestock accounts, labor contracts, but narrative texts as well, stories, origins, genealogies of gods, descriptions of cosmic events that, according to the texts themselves, occurred before the first cities existed. The Sumerians did not call these mythology. They had no word equivalent to our modern boundary between myth and history. They simply recorded. And what they recorded, they preserved with obsessive precision. Which is why when the last great king of Assyria, Ashurbanipal, assembled his library at Nineveh in the 7th century BCE, he collected texts from across Mesopotamia. He sent scribes to ancient cities to copy tablets that were already old. Copies of copies of copies. And those copies ended up in palace rooms that would remain buried until the modern world stumbled into them again. More than 30,000 clay tablets, broken, fragmentary, covered in cuneiform writing no one could yet read. And this is where the story turns quietly but decisively from the ancient world to our own. Because the tablets did not vanish, they waited. And when they were lifted from the earth and carried into museums, they did not become answers, not immediately. They became a question pressed into clay, waiting for someone to learn how to listen. And that listening begins with one of the strangest facts of all. For decades, the modern world possessed these words and did not know what they said. the excavations began in 1845. A British archaeologist, Austin Henry Layard, arrived at a mound on the east bank of the Tigris River, across from modern Mosul. Local people had known for generations that the mound contained ruins, old stones, buried walls, the presence of something dead but not gone. Layard proved it contained the remains of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire. He found winged bull colossi with human heads. He found reliefs of royal hunts and military campaigns. And he found rooms filled with broken clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of fragments covered in wedge-shaped marks. They were packed into crates and shipped to the British Museum. And for decades they sat in storage, catalogued by number, labeled, stacked, kept, not understood. Cuneiform was known to be writing, yes, but the languages it encoded were opaque. Sumerian had died as a spoken language long before the classical world. Akkadian, the Semitic language that replaced it, had vanished by the time the Roman Empire rose. The modern world looked at these tablets and saw script, but not speech. So the tablets became something like a sealed room, present, real, mute. The decipherment happened gradually, not through a single eureka moment, but through a slow unlocking, like turning a key you are not certain fits and hearing faintly the mechanism shift. In 1835, Henry Rawlinson began copying the trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun in Persia. The same message repeated in 3 scripts, Old Persian Elamite and Babylonian. Because scholars could read Old Persian, it became the wedge that opened the others. By the 1850s, a handful of scholars could translate Akkadian texts. By the 1870s, they were translating Sumerian as well, using bilingual Sumerian-Akkadian dictionaries that ancient scribes themselves had created for their own students. It is worth pausing here, because what that means is that the decipherment of Sumerian was not only a modern triumph, it was also an ancient gift. The scribes who lived thousands of years ago anticipated the death of their language. They built tools to preserve it. They built bridges across time, not knowing who would cross them. And then in November 1872, a man named George Smith sat in a back room of the British Museum examining fragments from Ashurbanipal's library. Smith was not born into academia. He had started as an apprentice banknote engraver. He taught himself in his spare time by studying the museum's collections. His skill was so evident that the museum hired him as an assistant. On that November day, he was piecing together fragments labeled with various K numbers, the Nineveh designation given to tablets from that site. And the text he reconstructed described a great flood sent by gods to destroy humanity. One man was warned. He built a boat. He survived. The parallels to the biblical flood story were unmistakable. Smith reportedly became so excited, he began tearing off his clothes. What he had discovered was a portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a flood account embedded in a longer narrative about a king's quest for immortality. The survivor's name was Utnapishtim, and the gods who sent the flood were the Anunnaki. But what matters here, what matters for our investigation, is not only that the flood story existed earlier than the Bible. It's what the text makes clear about the decision itself. The decision was not unanimous. The gods debated. They argued. One god, Enki, called Ea in the Akkadian version, secretly warned the flood hero, defying the assembly's decision. So even here, in one of the most famous discoveries of ancient literature, the pattern appears: divine governance is not unified autocracy. It is contentious assembly, The gods are not a single will. They form factions. They compete for authority, and at times they go to war. The tablets document this not once, not as an aberration, but repeatedly across multiple narratives in texts separated by centuries found in cities hundreds of miles apart. Consider what that implies. These were not isolated fantasies authored privately by individuals inventing worlds. These were texts copied in scribal schools, taught to students, preserved across generations, as cultural inheritance, treated as accounts worth keeping alive. So we return to the question again, because the texts themselves keep returning to it. What were the Sumerians preserving? What did they believe these narratives represented? The mainstream scholarly answer is straightforward ideological myths. Narratives shaped to explain natural phenomena, justify social structures, and project human political forms onto the divine realm. When gods debate in assembly, it reflects human assembly. When gods fight, it dramatizes theology. The conflicts are not real, just literary devices. But notice what that interpretation requires. It requires assuming the Sumerians drew the same boundary, we draw a clean line between history and myth. A line the texts themselves never mark. There is no once upon a time that announces a shift into fiction. And the most unsettling evidence of that is not a poetic myth at all. It is a reference document, a list, a chronology, the Sumerian king list. The king lists and genealogical records transition smoothly from antediluvian kings, who supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years, to post-flood kings with more plausible reign lengths, to historically verified kings whose monuments have been excavated. The narrative treats them as a continuum. The Weld-Blundell prism, catalogued as MS 3175 in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, presents this most clearly. The prism is a clay four-sided column inscribed with the Sumerian king list. It dates to approximately 1800 BCE, though the list itself compiles traditions reaching back centuries earlier. The text begins, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then names 8 kings from 5 cities who ruled before the flood with reign lengths that are staggering 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Then almost casually it says, then the flood swept over. And it continues. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, a second time the kingship was in Kish. It lists post-flood kings moving step by step toward dynasties we can anchor in archaeology. The transition is seamless. No warning that we should read the first section symbolically and the second historically. Both sections present kingship as something that descends from above. Both sections list rulers as though the list is record, not story. So we circle back again, not because repetition is filler, but because repetition is what the evidence forces. If we entertain the possibility that the Sumerians believed they were recording actual events, then the divine conflicts documented in these texts take on different weight. They become not abstractions, but political catastrophe at cosmic scale. A civil war among ruling powers. And humanity created to serve, caught in the middle. In part 3, we step closer to the machinery of that governance, into the assembly itself, into the language of decree and jurisdiction, into the concept of ME and the tablet of destinies, and into the recurring pattern that keeps appearing like a bruise beneath the surface. Authority in heaven, like authority on earth, is not simply held. It is contested. It is transferred. It is stolen. And sometimes it is taken back by force. if there is a single thread that binds these texts together across cities, across centuries, across changing empires, it is the idea that reality itself is governed. Not merely influenced, governed, structured by decrees, administered through procedure, allocated through authority that can be recognized, challenged, revoked, reassigned. And once you begin looking for that thread, you see it everywhere. Because the gods in these tablets do not behave like distant abstractions. They behave like office holders. They sit in councils. They deliberate. They issue decisions with consequences. They argue about jurisdiction. They enforce rulings. They negotiate settlements after crises. They respond to rebellion with policy. It is in a strange way familiar, and it begins with a word that appears again and again in Mesopotamian literature whenever divine governance is described: the assembly. In the Penn Museum's Babylonian collection tablet, CBS 10,673 holds particular significance for understanding that structure. Excavated at Nippur and dated to approximately 1650 BCE. It contains a Sumerian flood account, older than the more famous Akkadian narratives that later appear in Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. What makes it valuable here is not only the flood story, but the framework around it. Before the flood, the text describes decision-making. The gods assemble. They deliberate. They take formal action. The divine assembly, often translated as the assembly of the gods, the place where destinies are determined, not a casual gathering, a structured council with recognized authority to make binding decisions about cosmic and earthly affairs. And within that structure, certain figures appear with remarkable consistency. Anu, the sky god, holds the highest rank, ancient and remote. Enlil, god of wind and storm, exercises executive authority, chairing the active assembly. Enki, god of subterranean waters and wisdom, serves as counselor and craftsman, the one who designs solutions. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, embodies generative power. Nana, moon god, marks time and cyclical order. Utu, sun god, embodies justice and revelation. Inanna, goddess of love and war, exerts power over human destinies. 7. Sometimes called the gods who decree fate, sometimes called simply the Seven. And then there is the word Anunnaki itself, used with two distinct meanings the tablets never fully separate. In its broadest sense, it refers to the major deities, the descendants of heaven and earth, the high gods, as opposed to the Igigi, who in many texts appear as lesser gods, laborers, servants. But in other contexts, especially underworld texts like the descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki, are specifically the 7 judges who sit in the netherworld, a subset of the larger divine collective defined by function rather than genealogy. This is not contradiction. It is hierarchy. The Anunnaki as a class encompass divine authority. But within that class, certain gods hold supreme power exercised through assembly procedure. And here the texts begin to speak in their most revealing language, the language of decree. Because decisions made in assembly have the force of fate. They are not suggestions. They are not prayers. They are binding. And the Sumerian word that gathers this concept, difficult to translate cleanly into modern categories, is Me. Me is divine law, cosmic order, the fundamental decrees that structure reality itself. Control of Me is control of civilization. The texts list hundreds of ME priesthood warfare metalwork, writing music, judgment descent into the underworld domains of power, aspects of reality under divine administration. And the ME are not fixed forever. They can be transferred, they can be stolen, they can be reassigned through assembly decision or through force. There is a narrative where Inanna visits Enki in his city of Eridu and gets him drunk. While intoxicated, he gives her numerous ME. She loads them onto a boat and transports them to her city Uruk. When Enki sobers and realizes what has happened, he sends servants to retrieve them. But Inanna defends her acquisition. Uruk gains cosmic authority over domains previously controlled by Eridu. Often, this is read as divine comedy, a charming myth. But notice what sits beneath the humor. Power is transferable, competitive, subject to acquisition through cunning. The gods do not share authority equally, they compete for it. And the mechanisms of that competition assembly, debate theft, pursuit retrieval, mirror human political struggle with uncomfortable precision. Now place beside this another recurring object in Mesopotamian literature, the Tablet of Destinies. It appears again and again not as a vague metaphor, but as a thing described with unusual specificity, inscribed with writing, impressed with seals, held in the hand, worn on the breast, stolen, recovered, transferred. Possession of the tablet grants its holder the right to decree fate, to preside over the divine assembly, to exercise kingship over gods and mortals alike. And crucially, it gets stolen, repeatedly. The most famous account appears in the Anzu myth. A being named Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while Enlil bathes. With the tablet in his possession, Anzu claims supreme authority. Normal order halts. Enlil cannot function as executive. Someone must retrieve the tablet by force. The assembly needs a champion. They need someone who can fight. And the god who accepts the task again and again across versions is Ninurta, warrior god, son of Enlil, enforcer of established authority. He pursues Anzu to a mountain stronghold. He wages battle. And the conflict is depicted not as playful fantasy, but as crisis. The tablet's authority neutralizes weapons, reverses commands, destabilizes governance itself. Only through persistence, through tactics, through timing, through striking at vulnerability, does Ninurta succeed in killing Anzu and recovering the tablet. And then comes a detail that matters more than it seems to at first. Ninurta returns the tablet to Enlil. He does not keep it. He does not claim kingship for himself, which suggests something almost constitutional. Authority is not only power, authority is legitimacy. And legitimacy in these texts depends on procedure, on recognition, on proper transfer, on acceptance by the assembly. Anzu could steal the tablet, but he could not secure acceptance, so he could be killed. The stolen symbol could be taken back. Order could be restored. But if that is true, then another question rises quietly, insistently, because it will not let the story remain comfortable. If the Tablet of Destinies is vulnerable to theft, if possession can disrupt cosmic order, if legitimacy requires recognition that can be resisted, then the system is inherently unstable. And the texts do not hide that instability. They return to it. They repeat it. They preserve it across centuries, like a warning pressed into clay. And in Part 4, we follow that pattern further into the violent succession struggles of the Enuma Elish, into the split between Enlil and Enki, that keeps resurfacing in every crisis, and into the moment when governance itself, unable to resolve its own factional contradictions, turns toward its most extreme policy, not correction, not discipline, but reset, the flood. And once you accept that this system is vulnerable, once you accept that authority can be stolen, that legitimacy can be contested, that cosmic order can halt when symbols are taken, you begin to see something else. You begin to see that the Mesopotamian tradition does not place harmony at the center of reality. It places succession. It places regime change. It places the uneasy marriage of power and legitimacy again and again, like a pattern pressed into clay. And nowhere is that more explicit than in the text the later Mesopotamian world treated as canonical foundation, the Enuma Elish. 7 tablets, excavated from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, catalogued at the British Museum with various K numbers, K3473, K3567, K3945, and others assembled into a complete text through painstaking fragment matching. A creation account, yes, but also a war record. And the war matters because it does not read like a symbolic struggle between good and evil. It reads like a violent transfer of authority, an old regime collapsing and a new regime installing itself through crisis procedure. The narrative begins not with order, but with primordial mixing. 2 waters, Apsu, fresh water, and Tiamat, salt water. From their mingling, the first gods emerge. At first, they are less like individuals and more like forces, older beings without distinct personality, personified elements of reality. But their offspring are different. The younger gods are active, distinct, noisy. And the text emphasizes their noise. They dance. They celebrate. They disturb the ancient stillness. Apsu cannot rest. By day he cannot rest. By night he cannot sleep. And so he proposes something that in any reading is extreme. He will destroy the young gods and put an end to their ways, so silence may be restored. Tiamat protests. These are her children. How can we destroy what we have brought forth? But Apsu is determined. He consults with his vizier, Mumu, who encourages the plan. And the plan is clear: eliminate the offspring. Restore quiet. The young gods learn of it. They are terrified. And here at the beginning, you can already feel the structure that will repeat decision, reaction, countermeasure, escalation. Who among the young gods can stand against Apsu? None, until Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, produces a solution. Not brute force, cunning. Through magic and strategy, through a method the text treats as both intelligent and decisive, Ea casts Apsu into deep sleep and kills him while he slumbers. Ea claims Apsu's dwelling as his own. He establishes authority over the freshwater depths. And in that sea's dwelling, Ea's son is born Marduk. Tiamat, informed of her husband's death, seeks vengeance. But again, the text does not frame her as acting impulsively. She prepares. And the preparation reads like mobilization. She creates an army, monstrous beings, dragons, snake creatures, storm demons. She fashions weapons. She appoints Kingu as commander, and she gives him the Tablet of Destinies. This is not a decorative detail. It is the clearest statement possible that authority is transferable. Tiamat does not merely give Kingu a title. She gives him the object that grants the right to decree fate. She places legitimacy in his hands. The younger gods hear of Tiamat's preparations, and they assemble. Again, always the assembly, always the council chamber. They try negotiation. It fails. They need a champion. Anu attempts to confront her and turns back. Even the high sky authority withdraws. The gods are desperate. And then Marduk steps forward, young, powerful, possessing attributes the text describes in formal language, almost like credentials. He agrees to fight Tiamat, but he sets a condition. If he is to save them, they must convene the assembly and proclaim his destiny supreme. When they sit together in council, he will determine fates as they do. Whatever he creates shall remain unaltered. Let the command from his lips never be revoked. This is not simply a request. It is a demand made under crisis, and the assembly has no choice. They agree. They feast. They drink beer until they are drunk, until they are careless in their joy that someone will save them, and they proclaim Marduk is king. But notice what happens next. They test him. They place a garment before him and command him to destroy it and restore it using only his word. He speaks. The garment vanishes. He speaks again. It reappears. The test proves his authority is operational, not symbolic, not merely honored functional. Satisfied, the assembly grants him kingship, gives him throne and scepter, provides irresistible weapons. And Marduk goes to war. The battle is described with physicality. Marduk fashions a net to entangle Tiamat. He commands winds, storm wind, whirlwind, hurricane, then creates 7 additional winds. He mounts his storm chariot drawn by horses with poison in their mouths. They meet. They exchange challenges. Tiamat opens her jaws to swallow him. He drives the evil wind into her mouth so she cannot close. The winds distend her belly. He shoots an arrow down her throat. It pierces her heart. She dies. And then the regime change becomes irreversible. Marduk slaughters her army. He captures Kingu. He takes back the tablet of destinies and fastens it to his own breast. He returns to Tiamat's corpse and splits it like a shellfish. One half becomes the sky, the other the earth. He organizes the cosmos, assigns stars, establishes the calendar positions, moon and sun. Order is built from the body of the defeated power, literally built from it. And then comes the administrative turn, the one that pulls the whole narrative back into the same framework we have been tracing. The gods are weary, divine labor is a burden. So Marduk proposes creating humanity to serve the gods. But humanity requires raw material. The assembly convenes. They ask who incited Tiamat to war. The gods identify Kingu. Marduk kills Kingu. From his blood mixed with clay, Ea creates humanity. Humans are assigned to maintain temples, provide offerings, perform labor that would otherwise burden the gods. The gods are grateful. They build Marduk a temple in Babylon. They recite his 50 names, each name a divine power, each a domain of supreme authority. This is a creation myth, but it is also a political template. Elder generation attempts genocide against offspring to restore quiet. Offspring kill elder. Elder seeks vengeance. Offspring need a champion. Champion demands permanent kingship as the price of salvation. assembly agrees under duress. Champion wins. Assembly ratifies after victory. New order is built from defeated bodies, from one angle heroic, from another angle opportunistic coup. And the text does not resolve the ambiguity. It leaves both readings alive side by side, like two shadows cast by the same fire. And once you see that, you begin to understand why the Mesopotamian tradition keeps returning to theft, to contested authority, to the vulnerability of symbols like the Tablet of Destinies. Because if cosmic order itself emerges from civil war, if legitimacy itself can be negotiated under crisis, then what prevents the next powerful being from using the same method? The text suggests the answer without speaking it directly. Nothing prevents it. The pattern repeats. And when it repeats, the battleground is not only heaven, it becomes humanity. Because humans in these narratives are not created out of benevolence. They are created to solve a labor crisis. And once created, the question of how to use them, control them, limit them, or eliminate them becomes one of the flashpoints of divine faction. Which brings us to the burden that sits beneath so many of these stories, the burden of work. The burden of governance, the burden of what the texts call the gods' load. And in part 5, we move into the atrahasis tradition, into the rebellion of the working gods, into the creation of humans as substitute labor, and into the escalating conflict between two powers who never stop circling one another, Enlil, who governs by authority, and Enki, who governs by cunning. There is a line in the atrahasis tradition that is almost too blunt to soften. It does not hide behind poetry. It does not try to make itself agreeable. It says, in effect, let man assume the drudgery of the god. And the reason that line matters is that it anchors everything that follows creation. Conflict flood, not in moral judgment, but in management. In the British Museum tablet, BM 78941 preserves portions of the Atrahasis, epic, one of the oldest Mesopotamian accounts linking creation, pre-flood history, and the flood itself. The tablet dates to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1700 BCE. Though the story it tells claims to reach back to the beginning of divine time. The opening is not what many expect. Before humans exist, the gods themselves perform labor. The text divides the divine realm into two classes, the Anunnaki, the great gods who hold administrative and executive authority, and the Igigi lesser gods assigned to physical work. And the text is explicit about that work. The Igigi dig canals, they clear rivers, they carry earth in baskets, they build irrigation systems. For 40 years, whether formulaic, whether literal, within the story's internal chronology, the Igigi labor under Anunnaki oversight. And then they rebel, not quietly, not symbolically, procedurally. They assemble at night. They surround the house of Enlil, the supreme executive. They burn their tools. They declare they will no longer work. The language is the language of collective refusal, of protest, of labor strike. Enlil responds with anger. He views this as insurrection. He summons the divine assembly. Anu and Enki join him to deliberate on how to respond. Enlil proposes crushing the revolt with force. He asks who is the leader who incited the rebellion so that individual can be singled out for punishment. But the Igigi respond collectively. They say, in effect, there is no single leader. Every one of us has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. This is crucial. It is not a coup by one ambitious god. It is a class revolt, and the assembly faces an actual crisis. If they crush the rebellion, who will do the work? The Anunnaki themselves. And the text suggests this is unthinkable. Their status depends on not performing manual labor. Their authority is structured around the idea that the burden belongs to someone else. So Enki proposes a solution. Create substitute laborers. Fashion beings who will take over the work the Igigi refuse to do. Create humans. And here the Atrahasis tradition becomes disturbing, not because it is violent, though it is, but because it is specific. The assembly decides to kill one god, a rebel Igigi, possibly the instigator they identify, and mix his blood and flesh with clay. The mixture is shaped into human form. The god's intelligence, his personality, what the text calls his ghost, becomes part of the human template. Humans will have divine elements within them, enough intelligence to understand commands and perform complex work, but not enough power to threaten divine authority. The mother goddess Nintu, also called by other names in the tradition, performs the physical creation under Enki's guidance. 7 male and 7 female humans are made. The text emphasizes they are made plural, capable of reproduction, designed to multiply and maintain their own population, and they are immediately assigned to work. The drudgery of the gods transfers to the human species. The Igigi are freed. The Anunnaki remain administrators. And for a time, the system works. Humans multiply. They fill the earth. They perform the labor assigned to them. The gods receive worship offering service. The machine runs. But then the machine produces a new problem. Humans become too numerous, too loud. Their clamor, the text says, disturbs Enlil's sleep. And this is where the conflict becomes repetitive, in a way that feels almost like a legal case being argued again and again with slightly different evidence. Enlil proposes population reduction. The assembly implements it. Humans die. But each time, Enki intervenes. Enlil proposes plague. Enki warns the humans. Enlil proposes famine. Enki shows them how to survive. Enlil proposes drought. Enki finds a way around it. The pattern repeats. Reduction, implementation, subversion, recovery. And the repetition matters because it reveals that this is not a single disagreement. It is a structural divide. Enlil views humans as servants whose numbers must be controlled. If they exceed their function, if they become too disruptive, then they must be culled like livestock, like crops, pruned to maintain a manageable yield. Enki treats humans differently. The text does not fully explain his motives, but it shows his actions with consistency that does not feel accidental. He protects humans. He provides knowledge to survive. He defies assembly decisions to preserve them. Why the Atrahasis tradition offers hints without choosing a single answer. Perhaps practical necessity, humans perform useful functions. Temple maintenance offerings labor. Eliminating them creates a vacuum the gods do not want to fill. Perhaps creative investment Enki supervised creation. Humans carry his imprint, his design, his wisdom. Destroying them wastes his work. Perhaps strategic interest. More humans mean more worship, more offerings, more influence, especially for the god who positions himself as protector and teacher. Perhaps Principal Enki is portrayed as wiser, more flexible, less driven, by executive rigidity. Perhaps he sees annihilation as excessive, crude, short-sighted. And perhaps it is not one motive. Perhaps it is all of them at once. Because in politics, divine or human motives overlap, reinforce, contradict, and still produce consistent behavior. What is clear is that the Enlil-Enki divide hardens. By the time the flood appears in these narratives, the conflict is no longer plague versus counter-plague. It is total erasure. Enlil proposes the flood as final solution. No survivors, complete reset. And the assembly agrees. The gods swear secrecy. No one will warn humanity. The flood will come without warning, so that humans cannot prepare, cannot preserve anything, cannot carry civilization through the reset. And Enki, bound by oath, finds his loophole. He does not speak directly to Atrahasis. He speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house. Reed wall, pay attention. He describes the flood. He describes the boat. He gives dimensions, supplies, animals, preservation. Atrahasis stands on the other side of the wall and hears. Technically, Enki has not broken his oath. Practically, he has shattered the assembly's plan. This is Enki's method, again, not open rebellion, but subversion through procedure. Not smashing the law, but slipping through the gap the law itself leaves open. The flood comes, the survivors endure. Offerings resume, and the gods, hungry without human service, gather around sacrifice like flies. Enlil arrives and sees that a human has survived. His fury is immediate. How did any man survive? He knows someone broke the pact of silence. And Enki, never denying, never fully confessing, reframes the crisis again, not as moral failure, but as policy failure. Total destruction was excessive. The solution is not extinction, but control. Make humans less fertile, institute death, limit lifespans, create constraints that keep numbers manageable without requiring periodic genocide. And the assembly accepts the compromise because circumstance forces acceptance. Humanity survives, but under terms that feel like an uneasy treaty. Neither faction gets exactly what it wants, and that is the point. Our existence in this narrative is not the product of unified divine will. It is the product of divine disagreement. We survive because one faction protected us against another faction's attempt to erase us. And the conditions of survival, mortality, suffering, limitation are the terms of a compromise between powers that never fully reconcile. So the question returns because the story forces it to return. If humanity exists as treaty, if we are the residue of factional conflict, then the deeper fault line matters more than any single flood. And that fault line is not only between classes of gods, or between generations, or between symbols of authority. It is between two brothers, two forms of power, two ways of ruling. Enlil, who governs by institutional legitimacy. Enki, who governs by knowledge and cunning. And now we return because the text keeps returning to the deepest fault line. Not the tablet alone, not the council alone, not even the flood alone. The fault line that sits underneath the flood, underneath the labor rebellion, underneath the repeated pattern of decision and defiance. Two brothers, two domains, two kinds of power that never fully blend. Every pantheon has sibling rivalry. We know the pattern. We expect it. We almost recognize it before it's spoken. But the rivalry between Enlil and Enki in the Mesopotamian tradition doesn't sit inside a single myth like a self-contained drama. It threads through everything, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied, sometimes spoken through direct conflict, and sometimes spoken through procedure, through who chairs the assembly, who holds the tablet, who gives counsel, who finds the loophole. And the reason it matters is that it shapes human fate across centuries of textual tradition. The genealogy matters because genealogy is never just biology in these texts. Genealogy is legitimacy. Both Enlil and Enki are sons of Anu, the sky god's supreme, distant ancient authority. In some traditions, they share the same mother. In others, they do not. And the texts never fully clarify which is correct. That ambiguity is not a small detail, because if succession were uncontested, if inheritance were simple, you would expect clarity. Instead, you get competing traditions. Different cities, different emphases, different versions of the same family story. And those differences matter because in Mesopotamia, temples were not just religious centers, they were institutions, economic engines, political structures. A city's patron deity was a city's claim to status. So when a text elevates a god, it elevates a city. And when it lowers a god, it lowers a city. The division of domains is consistent enough to feel like a constitutional settlement. Enlil receives authority over the upper world. The atmosphere storms winds the space between heaven and earth, where human life unfolds. Enki receives authority over the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, beneath the earth, the source of springs and wells, and the deep moisture that makes life possible. On the surface, this looks balanced. Enlil governs what is visible and dramatic storms that bring rain or devastation. Enki governs what is hidden and essential waters, without which nothing survives the deep places where wisdom and craft reside. But the text suggests this division satisfied neither brother. Because power is not only about a domain. Power is about how decisions are made. Power is about who sets policy, who decrees fate, who has the right to rule. Enlil holds executive authority in the divine assembly. He chairs the council. He possesses the tablet of destinies in the narratives where that object is present. His cult center is Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, where kings came to have authority legitimated. Enlil's supremacy is institutional. It is embedded in ritual, in recognition, in procedure. Enki, by contrast, rules the depths. His cult center is Eridu, the city tradition claimed as the oldest, where kingship first descended from heaven. Enki possesses wisdom, cunning, magical knowledge. He is the god of crafts, practical intelligence, clever solutions to impossible problems. But he does not chair the assembly. He advises, he proposes, he suggests. And then Enlil decides. And the texts portray Enki's response to this subordinate position with remarkable consistency. He does not rebel openly. He does not storm the council chamber and seize the tablet. He does not declare himself king. Instead, he does something more subtle. He subverts. He finds the technically legal gap. He obeys the letter and undermines the intent. He works inside procedure in a way that makes procedure itself unstable. The flood narrative is the clearest example, but not the only one. The assembly decides to erase humanity. Enki finds a loophole. He speaks to a wall. He preserves what was meant to be destroyed while maintaining plausible deniability. And the story treats this as clever and transgressive at the same time. Not chaos, not whimsy, a legal maneuver, a procedural betrayal. And when you see that, once you begin to see it everywhere, because the rivalry is not just personal, it is structural. Enlil represents institutional authority, order, hierarchy, executive power, legitimacy, enforced through recognition. Enki represents intellectual power, knowledge craft, cunning, the ability to solve problems by rewriting the rules without openly breaking them. Neither power alone can sustain the system. Enlil's order, without Enki's flexibility, becomes brittle. Enki's cleverness, without Enlil's structure, becomes chaotic. So the system functions through opposition. But functional opposition is not harmony. It is constant negotiation, constant tension, a balance that always risks tipping into open conflict. And the text suggests that balance nearly broke during the flood crisis. Enlil proposed total destruction. The assembly carried the vote. Enki undermined it. Humans survived. And the post-flood settlement was not reconciliation. It was compromise forced by circumstance. The question then isn't whether Enlil and Enki disagree. The question is what happens when disagreement becomes irreconcilable. What happens when procedure cannot contain rivalry? What happens when a symbol like the tablet becomes a weapon? The texts do not give a single clean answer. Instead, they keep circling the same pattern. Authority is contested. A crisis emerges. Someone takes or steals a symbol. The assembly reacts. A champion enforces. The system resets. And then later it happens again, because the rivalry becomes a template that repeats across generations. Older powers threatened by younger powers. Younger powers demanding recognition. Succession enacted through violence, then justified through procedure. The Enuma Elish gives you that pattern at cosmic scale. Atrahasis gives you that pattern at human scale. The Tablet of Destiny's narratives give you that pattern at constitutional scale. And the question keeps returning because the texts keep returning. If the system's stability depends on a balance between two rival forms of power, authority, and cunning, then what happens when a third factor enters, a military arm? A loyal enforcer. A champion who can restore symbols by force. Because once theft becomes possible, someone must retrieve what was stolen. Once legitimacy becomes contested, someone must enforce legitimacy. And in the Mesopotamian tradition, the god who fills that role again and again has a particular shape, not as judge, not as counselor, but as weapon. The warrior son, the enforcer of the regime. Ninurta. It's worth pausing here before we follow Ninurta into the mountains, because it's easy, too easy to rush past what his presence implies. A system that needs a champion is a system that expects challenges. A system that keeps losing symbols of authority is a system that can be infiltrated. A system that repeatedly requires retrieval by force is a system that does not rest in stable legitimacy. It rests in enforcement. And so, when Ninurta appears in the texts, he is not simply a heroic figure slaying monsters for entertainment. He is something closer to an institution, the military arm of the regime, the force that restores order when procedure alone fails. In Mesopotamian literature, Ninurta appears in multiple roles. Agricultural god, who brings seasonal floods. Warrior god, who defeats threats. Son of Enlil, who enforces his father's authority. The electronic text. Corpus of Sumerian literature preserves the Sumerian version of his most famous exploit, catalogued as ETCSL 1.6.2, known as Lugal-E, or Ninurta's exploits. Akkadian versions exist as well, including tablets from Ashurbanipal's library. And the consistency across versions matters, because it tells you this narrative wasn't a local curiosity. It was a central story, copied and preserved. The narrative begins with crisis. A being called Anzu has stolen the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil. With the tablet, Anzu claims supreme authority. Cosmic order halts. Normal functioning of divine governance breaks down. Someone must retrieve the tablet by force. And here the text forces you to sit with the same uncomfortable question. Again, how can the supreme executive be robbed? How can the symbol of legitimacy be taken? How can authority be vulnerable to theft? The tradition varies in how it describes Anzu. Sometimes a bird god, sometimes a lion-headed eagle, sometimes a storm creature of enormous power. Sometimes the name appears differently in Sumerian tradition. The variations suggest multiple streams, either different traditions about the same figure or conflation of different figures across time. But the role remains consistent. Anzu steals the tablet, and the theft is treated not as minor crime, not as prank, but as constitutional catastrophe. Because with the tablet in his possession, Anzu does not merely possess a trophy. He possesses the right to decree fate. He possesses the ability to neutralize the authority of others. The assembly convenes to address the crisis. Multiple gods are asked to volunteer for the mission. Each refuses or fails. The texts list the hesitation, the reluctance, the fear. Because Anzu holding the tablet is not simply strong. He is legitimized, at least temporarily, by possession. And then Ninurta accepts the task. Not casually, not impulsively, as if accepting a duty. He is specifically suited for the mission, Enlil's son, the rightful defender, the one with legitimate reason to restore his father's authority. He is a warrior with weapons. And crucially, he is loyal. He fights not to seize the tablet for himself, but to return it. And again, that detail should not be treated as decorative, because the entire system depends on that distinction. A champion who keeps stolen authority is a new usurper. A champion who returns stolen authority is an enforcer. Ninurta arms himself. The text names weapons, describes them, frames preparation as methodical. And then the pursuit begins. The geography is noted. Mountain strongholds, fortified terrain, a sense of campaign. It does not read like a dream drifting from scene to scene. It reads like a record of action, pursuit, engagement, repeated attempts. When Ninurta confronts Anzu, the tablet's tactical significance becomes explicit. Ninurta shoots arrows. They turn back. Ninurta commands winds. Anzu redirects them. The tablet grants authority over reality itself, allowing its wielder to countermand other divine commands. So Ninurta cannot simply overpower Anzu through brute force. Direct assault is neutralized. And this is where the story becomes strangely procedural, again, even in battle, because it implies that authority once seized has operational force. It implies that symbols are not empty. They do something. They change what is possible. So Ninurta adapts. He persists. He searches for vulnerability. He strikes at moments when Anzu cannot effectively deploy the tablet's authority. The text, damaged in places, does not always preserve every tactical detail clearly, but the pattern is visible: repeated attempts, repeated countermeasures, eventual breakthrough. Anzu is killed, the tablet is recovered, and Ninurta returns it to Enlil. And once you reach that moment, the narrative turns, and this turn is often passed over too quickly, because Ninurta does not end the story with Anzu's death. He reorganizes what supported Anzu. The Lugal-E tradition contains extensive passages where Ninurta addresses stones and minerals, declaring their fates. Some stones are blessed for usefulness or neutrality. Others are cursed for supporting Anzu's rebellion. It reads like the aftermath of war, the victor redistributing resources, rewarding allies, punishing supporters of the defeated enemy. He is not simply a fighter, he is an executive agent. But he is an executive agent acting on behalf of Enlil, not in his own name. And that is why the assembly accepts his actions. Because legitimacy is not only what you can take. Legitimacy is what the structure recognizes. Anzu could steal the tablet, but he could not convert theft into accepted kingship because the other gods did not recognize his claim. So they sent a champion. They used force to reverse the theft, and they restored the symbol to the recognized executive. But ask the question that the story quietly asks without answering. If the system requires this, if supreme authority can be stolen, if order must be restored through violent retrieval, then how often does this happen? How many times has the tablet changed hands? How many attempted coups have been framed as chaos so that suppression looks like justice? Because political propaganda always frames rivals as threats to order. The Anzu narrative can be read as cosmic monster slaying, and it can be read as internal coup attempt, crushed by the ruler's son. The text permits both readings. It even seems to depend on that ambiguity. And if ambiguity is built into the tradition, then the system itself is built on something unstable. The constant possibility that order is simply the name the victors give to their rule. And yet the tradition insists without enforcement, the system collapses. So Ninurta becomes necessary. A loyal champion, a weapon that doesn't seize kingship, a stabilizer that restores stolen symbols. But even that reveals a final unease, because loyalty is not guaranteed forever, and symbols once proven stealable remain stealable. So the question returns again, because the texts keep returning. If cosmic governance is maintained through a combination of assembly recognition, symbolic regalia, and military enforcement, what happens when those elements collide across realms, across jurisdictions, across boundaries where Enlil's authority does not reach? Because not all Anunnaki sit in the same council chamber. Not all Anunnaki recognize the same law, and so we descend. Not because the story needs spectacle, not because the tradition is trying to entertain us with darkness, but because the texts insist quietly, relentlessly, that authority is not singular, that governance is not one clean chain of command, that the Anunnaki is not one unified body sitting in one hall under one law. There are realms, there are jurisdictions, there are boundaries that matter. And when a god crosses a boundary, status does not travel with them the way you expect. In the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection tablet K162, excavated from Nineveh, preserves an Akkadian version of the descent of Ishtar into the underworld. The Sumerian version featuring Inanna exists in multiple fragmentary tablets, including a fragment published as UET 6/19, different versions, different details, but the same spine. A goddess of the upper world decides to go down. And what happens to her down there is not framed as tragedy alone. It is framed as procedure. Inanna Ishtar, in the Akkadian tradition, is a goddess of both love and war, a deity of tremendous power in the upper world. She moves among kings. She shapes destinies. She holds regalia that in these texts is never merely decorative. Regalia is jurisdiction. Regalia is authority made visible. And the underworld, the texts tell us, does not permit the powers of the living to enter intact. Inanna decides to descend. Her motivations vary by version funerary rites for Gugalana, the bull of heaven, a desire to extend power, a simple decision whose deeper intent remains opaque. But the narrative does something important before it moves into darkness. It prepares. Because Inanna, even as a goddess, understands risk, she arranges for rescue if she does not return. She instructs her attendant. She lays out procedure for what must be done. Already this is not whimsy. It is governance. It is contingency planning. Then she dresses in full divine regalia, a crown, a lapis lazuli necklace, beads, a breastplate, a ring, a rod of authority, royal robes. She does not go down as a naked soul. She goes down as a sovereign. She arrives at the first gate. She demands entry. The gates are guarded. The gatekeeper Nedi reports her arrival to Ereshkigal, ruler of the underworld. And Ereshkigal does not welcome her sister. Instead, she instructs Nedi to let Inanna enter, yes, but to enforce the ancient laws of the underworld. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearable in its calmness, because nothing explodes, nothing magical breaks the rules. The rules hold. At each gate, one item is removed. At the first gate, her crown. At the second, her necklace. At each gate, Inanna protests. At each gate, the gatekeeper replies with the same chilling finality. Be silent, Inanna. The decrees of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. 7 gates, 7 removals, and you can feel with each gate the stripping away of jurisdiction. As if the underworld is not just removing jewelry, it is removing claims, removing legal standing, removing the visible proofs of power. By the 7th gate, Inanna enters the throne room of the underworld naked, stripped of all authority, all protection, all regalia that would matter upstairs. And there she stands before Ereshkigal and the 7. The text names them, the 7 Anunnaki judges, the Anunna, the 7 who pronounce judgment. And the wording is unmistakably judicial. They look at her. It is the look of death. They speak to her. It is the speech of anger. They shout at her. It is the shout of heavy guilt. Judgment is pronounced. Sentence is executed. Inanna is turned into a corpse, and the corpse is hung on a hook. A goddess of the upper world dies in the lower world, not because she lacks power in the universe, but because she has entered a realm where her power has no standing. This is the point the tradition forces you to sit with. Not simply that the underworld is scary, but that the underworld is governed, that it has decrees, that it has judges, that it has procedures applied even to a goddess, and that these judges do not defer to the assembly above. They do not consult Enlil. They do not check Anu's will. They do not recognize Inanna's rank from her home jurisdiction. Within the underworld, they are law. And the moment you accept that, really accept it, you see the structure of divine governance splitting vertically. Anunnaki above, Anunnaki below, different jurisdiction, different authority, different law. And the boundary between them is not philosophical. It is enforced, gate by gate, decree by decree. And then as the narrative continues, the rescue arrives, but even the rescue cannot simply overturn underworld law. Inanna's attendant follows the instructions left behind and appeals to Enki. Enki creates special beings, crafted entities, capable of entering the underworld to retrieve her. But the retrieval requires a substitution. Someone must take her place. The underworld does not release a body for nothing, and the texts describe the search for a substitute, eventually falling on Dumuzi Inanna's husband, who failed to mourn her absence and must pay the price. Again, procedure, a trade, a legal exchange, not chaos, not sentiment. This is what makes the descent narrative so revealing. It shows a governance structure where authority is divided, where realms are not subordinate departments under one executive. They are jurisdictions with their own decrees. And when jurisdictions overlap, when actions in the upper world flood the lower world with the dead, when policy decisions above fill the underworld with ghosts, the potential for conflict becomes obvious. The texts hint at this without fully dramatizing it. Upper world gods decide. Lower world gods receive consequences. Who has final authority when interests collide? The tradition does not give a clean answer. And that lack of a clean answer matters, because a contested boundary is a fault line, and fault lines do not stay quiet forever. So now we have multiple axes of division, not just Enlil versus Enki, not just elder versus younger, not just Anunnaki versus Igigi, but above versus below, different councils, different sevens, different decrees, and when you add them together, you get not a pantheon of harmony, but a structure of governance that can fracture in many directions. Which brings us to the darkest pattern the texts preserve, not a single event, but a mechanism of transfer, a mechanism of succession. Because if authority is contested, then the question is not only who holds it now. The question becomes, how does it change hands? And in part 9, the tradition gives an answer so stark, so cyclical, so violent, that it reads less like one story and more like a template succession, through patricide repeated until violence becomes procedure. There are stories that feel like narratives, and there are stories that feel like systems. The disturbing power of the dynasty of Dunu tradition is that it does not behave like a tale about personalities. It behaves like a machine, a loop, a sequence that repeats so cleanly you begin to wonder if you're reading literature, or a memory of how authority works when no one can afford to lose. The tablet is fragmentary, poorly preserved, its provenance uncertain, its place in the broader tradition debated. Some scholars treat it as marginal, local aberrant. Others see it as preserving a darker pattern that other texts echo without stating so plainly. But what remains is enough to reveal the structure. A son is born. The son grows. The son kills his father. The son marries his mother or his sister. The son rules until his own son grows. Then the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. The names Harab Lahar and others exist, but the names matter less than the pattern, because the pattern is the message. Patricide is not accident, it is succession. Violence is not interruption, it is procedure. And when you sit with that, you start to see how it fits into the wider Mesopotamian picture we've been tracing. Because the Enuma Elish may not present the same blunt, father-killing loop in exactly the same form, but it preserves the same underlying logic. Authority does not pass peacefully. It passes through crisis, through overthrow, through elimination, through regime change justified afterward. Apsu attempts to destroy the younger gods. Ea kills Apsu. Tiamat seeks vengeance. Kingu is appointed and given the Tablet of Destinies. Marduk demands permanent kingship as the price of saving the assembly. He wins, he kills, he takes the tablet, he is ratified. Order is built from the body of the defeated. That is not a gentle inheritance, that is revolution made constitutional. And the question the tradition keeps raising without ever stating it as a modern question is simple. Is this evolution or is it propaganda? Is the Enuma Elish a more civilized version of succession, moving from raw patricide into assembly procedure? Or is it the same violence dressed in legality, so the victor can be called rightful? The text does not answer. It does not need to. Because the pattern speaks. In one framing, the dynasty of Dunu is archaic brutality, son kills, father takes mother, repeats until stability eventually emerges. In another framing, the dynasty of Dunu is not archaic. It is honest. It is what later texts disguise. Because later texts still contain the killings, Apsu, Tiamat, Kingu. They still contain the elimination of rival power. They simply attach a seal afterward, assembly recognition. 50 names, temple building, ritual confirmation, a throne and scepter. It is violence followed by legitimation. And once that template exists, once a culture preserves it, copies it, teaches it, then the template becomes a path, a known mechanism, a way to understand how power changes hands, create or exploit crisis, demonstrate superior strength, force recognition, eliminate rivals, consolidate. And you can see that logic echoing through the theft narratives too. Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies. He holds it. Authority halts. Order collapses. The assembly reacts. A champion is sent. Anzu is killed. The tablet is restored. Order is proclaimed restored. But here, the text becomes ambiguous in a way that should make you pause. Is Anzu an external chaos force? Or is Anzu an internal rival? Is the theft a monster story? Or is it a coup attempt framed as chaos so that suppression becomes justice? The tradition allows both, and that is exactly the kind of ambiguity you find in political propaganda, because political propaganda always frames the rival as disorder, always frames the challenger as threat, always frames the regime as order itself. And if that is true, if some chaos monsters are merely rivals rebranded as chaos, then the war narratives begin to read less like metaphysical battles and more like regime maintenance. Violent enforcement against challengers, repeated enforcement that never truly ends because the structure keeps producing challengers. And then, as if to underline the point, the tradition mirrors itself in human history. The Sumerian king list does something remarkably similar. It records dynasties, it records transfers of kingship, and it does so with a phrase that feels almost chilling in its matter-of-factness. Then it was defeated, and the kingship was taken to conquest as succession, violence as transfer, legitimacy as something you can seize, then record. So when you see patricide as pattern in divine texts, you should not assume you are seeing something alien to human experience. You may be seeing a cosmic projection of the same anxiety humans lived with in the city-states of Mesopotamia. How does power pass? How is stability maintained? What happens when legitimacy is contested? And what happens when no mechanism exists to resolve contest without force? Because if violence is the expected mechanism, then civil war is not aberration. Civil war is system function. And once you accept that the flood begins to look different, not as an isolated moral event, not as a story that exists mainly to explain why humans die, but as escalation, as policy, as a solution proposed by one faction when the usual tools plague famine drought, limited punishments no longer achieve control. If the system's default mode is periodic violent transfer and enforcement, then resetting humanity through total destruction is not out of character. It is the same logic applied at maximum scale. A decisive strike. Eliminate the problem. Start again. But as the Atrahasis tradition insists, the decision is not unanimous. There is opposition. There is subversion. There is the loophole. And the survival of humanity becomes evidence that even the most extreme policy cannot be executed without fracture. So the question returns again, as it always returns. If the Anunnaki system is competitive, if authority is transferable, if succession is violent, if realms are divided, then the flood is not the end of conflict. It is the climax of one phase, a climax that forces compromise, a compromise that leaves the underlying fault lines intact. And this is why the flood narratives across traditions, Eridu, Genesis, fragments, Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh episode, do not feel like one story told once. They feel like a cultural memory reapproached repeatedly from different angles. Because the flood is too large to be a single myth told for amusement. It is treated as a hinge, a break, a reset, and it is approached with the seriousness reserved for foundational catastrophe. So we come back to the flood, not as a single story you know, not as a moral lesson you were taught, not as a neat episode that lives in one tradition and ends with a rainbow. We come back to it the way these texts come back to it again and again, because the flood is not treated as an isolated tale. It is treated as a turning point, a hinge in the world, a line that divides before from after. And if we are tracing the possibility of civil war, factional conflict inside the divine order, then the flood sits where escalation becomes policy. The flood narratives across Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu, Genesis, fragments, the Atrahasis, epic, the flood episode embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, share core elements while varying in details. And those variations are not the point. The point is the shared structure, because the shared structure is what a culture preserves when it wants to preserve what it considers foundational. It preserves the core. It allows the edges to shift, and the core across versions is unambiguous. The flood is deliberate, decided by council, sent as policy, intended to destroy humanity. When the texts give reasons, they often give the same ones. Overpopulation, noise, the clamor of human life disturbing Enlil's rest. At first glance, it sounds petty. A god who cannot sleep, so he destroys civilization. But notice how the texts frame noise. Noise is not simply sound. Noise is expansion, growth, complexity, humanity multiplying, filling the land, building cities, creating systems that begin to operate with momentum. The noise is the evidence of humanity becoming too large to remain a controlled servant class. The noise is the signal that the created labor force is no longer quietly performing its function. It is becoming something else, and some versions gesture toward another problem. Humans in certain tellings stop fulfilling divine requirements properly. Offerings diminish, attention shifts, independence grows. And if humanity exists in these narratives to serve specific divine purposes, maintain temples, provide labor, bring offerings, then misbehavior is not only moral, it is functional. The product is failing to meet specification. The servant class is exceeding parameters. So the flood reads less like tantrum and more like management. Cold decision, executive logic, terminate and reset. But what matters for our purposes is not only the reason given, it is the mechanism by which the decision is made. Because the text insists the decision is made in assembly. The gods convene, they deliberate, they take formal action, they bind themselves by oath, they enforce secrecy. The flood is not random disaster. It is a procedure executed by governance. And in the Atrahasis epic, the procedural framing is especially stark. Enlil proposes population reduction, repeatedly plague, famine, drought. Each time the assembly implements, each time Enki intervenes, each time humanity recovers. So the pattern becomes almost ritual. Enlil reduce, assembly enact, Enki circumvent, humanity survive. But in a competitive system, repeated circumvention is not merely annoyance. It is political defiance. It is rivalry made operational. So eventually Enlil escalates. No more partial measures, no more adjustable levers, total erasure. And now the conflict moves into its most dangerous form, not disagreement about policy, but an attempt to eliminate the contested resource entirely. If humans are the labor base, the offering base, the worship base, then controlling humans means controlling power. And eliminating humans removes that resource from all factions. It is the ultimate move. If I cannot manage the human problem under the current arrangement, then I will end the arrangement itself. And if my rivals lose their base with me, so be it. This is why the oath matters. The texts emphasize it. The gods swear secrecy. No one will warn humanity. The flood will come without warning. No survivors, because survival would preserve the old order. Survival would preserve continuity, and continuity is the enemy of reset. Then comes the moment that defines the entire conflict. Enki is bound by oath. Enki is outvoted, if we think in modern terms, or overridden by Enlil's executive authority. The decision is formal, and yet Enki does not accept it. He finds the loophole. He does not speak directly to Atrahasis. He speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house. Reed wall, pay attention. And he gives practical instructions dimensions, materials, supplies, what to bring, what to preserve. The text treats this as clever and transgressive at once, because the point is not that Enki technically obeys the oath. The point is that Enki preserves deniability while committing the deepest betrayal possible in a factional system. He undermines the assembly's chosen policy. He preserves what was meant to be destroyed. He does it intentionally. And he does it in a way that reveals how deeply law and loophole are embedded, even in divine governance. Then the flood comes. In the texts, the flood is not gentle. It is not symbolic drizzle. It is force, storm, collapse. For 7 days and 7 nights, in many versions, the waters rise. Cities vanish. Civilization is erased. And the gods' reaction is described with a detail that should not be ignored. They are horrified. Not because they did not decide it, but because they did. Because ordering destruction is different from watching destruction happen. The text described them cowering like dogs watching the waters. The mother goddess laments. How could I agree to this? How could I speak for evil? In the assembly, there is regret. There is panic. And in some versions, there is hunger. Because when humans die, offerings stop. Temples fall silent. The gods are suddenly without what humans provided. And in that silence, in that emptiness, the policy reveals its flaw. Erasure solves the noise problem, but erasure creates another problem. The gods have eliminated their own infrastructure, the system that made their rule comfortable. They have destroyed the servants who maintain the world. So, when Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on version, emerges, he makes an offering. And the text described the gods gathering around it like flies. Desperate, drawn by the smell. This is not a flattering image. It is not meant to be. It is meant to show dependence. The gods need humans, not as equals, as function, as service, as fuel for the system. And then Enlil arrives and sees the survivor, and his rage is immediate. How did any man survive? The decision was for total destruction. The oath was sworn. So survival is not miracle. Survival is betrayal. Enlil knows instantly someone broke the pact, and he suspects Enki. Enki does not truly deny it. Instead, he reframes. He argues that total destruction was excessive, that the problem was not existence, but overpopulation, that genocide is crude management. The solution is not elimination, it is control. And now the assembly, confronted with reality. Humans survived, and gods need humans, must choose. Destroy the survivors and accept permanent loss of offerings, or accept compromise so they negotiate the post-flood settlement. Humans will continue, but under limits, shorter lifespans. Infertility for some death built into the system, diseases, predators, constraints that prevent the clamor from returning to intolerable levels. And here is the crucial point. This is not triumph. It is not reconciliation. It is treaty. A compromise order, forced by exhaustion. Enlil's faction does not get total erasure, but gets population controls. Enki's faction does not get unlimited flourishing, but gets survival. Neither side fully wins. which means the underlying conflict remains. Because when a system ends in compromise rather than resolution, the tensions do not vanish. They settle, they wait, they remain. So, if we read the flood as the climax of factional violence, the flood is not the end of war. It is the moment war becomes too destructive to continue at that intensity, forcing temporary settlement. And if that is the structure, then post-flood is not peace. It is the aftershock period, a world rebuilt under terms that no one fully loves. A world maintained by uneasy balance between powers that have already proven willing to erase everything. And this brings us back again to the pre-flood kings, because the king list marks the flood as a clean break. Then the flood swept over, and then it continues, and that break, textually seamless, conceptually enormous, raises the final haunting question. If kingship descended from heaven before the flood, if the pre-flood world was governed differently, then what were those kings? What changed after? So we return once more to the king list. Because the king list doesn't behave like a myth that knows it is a myth. It behaves like a record, a reference document, a backbone of legitimacy, a way of saying this is where authority came from and this is how it moved. And whether we treat it as symbolic or literal, the king list insists on one thing with unwavering calm. There was a before, there was an after, and the flood is the line between them. The Weld Blundell Prism catalog number MS 3175 in the Ashmolean Museum preserves the most complete version of the Sumerian king list we possess, dating to around 1800 BC, compiling traditions older than itself. It begins with a sentence that modern readers often slide past as a formula. But formulas in these texts are never empty. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Kingship descended. It came down. It was not invented. It was not negotiated into existence by human communities' slowly evolving bureaucracy. It arrived as a grant, an imposition, a transfer from above to below. And the king list does not treat that statement as metaphor. It treats it as premise. Then come the names, 8 kings, 5 cities, and reign lengths that in our terms shatter ordinary biology. 28,800 years, 36,000, 43,200, numbers that do not drift near the plausible, numbers that sit in a different category entirely. And mainstream scholarship responds in several familiar ways. Symbolic exaggeration, mistranscription, different number bases misunderstood, dynasties rather than individuals, a compression where years might mean something other than solar years. These are all possible explanations. Some are elegant, some are practical, and all of them share one underlying assumption. The numbers as written cannot mean what they appear to say, so something must be off. But pause. Not because you need to accept the numbers literally, not because you must, but because the king list itself does not behave as if it is embarrassed by them. It does not apologize. It does not mark them as symbolic. It does not say, this is the time of gods, so do not read this as history. It simply lists the way records list name. City, reign length, next name, next city, next reign length. And then as if nothing unusual has happened, it reaches the line. Then the flood swept over, and then it continues. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, a second time the kingship was in Kish, again descended, again from heaven, Again, the same framing. And then the post-flood kings appear. And what happens to the numbers is striking. They begin high, still strange, still inflated by modern standards, and then gradually they shrink. Down through generations, toward reign lengths that resemble what human history can actually hold. And the transition is seamless. No boundary marker that says now we leave myth and enter history. No explicit shift in genre. No formal announcement that the earlier section should be interpreted differently. From the internal logic of the text, it is continuous. And that continuity matters because it forces a question: what did the scribes believe they were preserving? Because the king list was not merely entertainment. It functioned as legitimacy, as lineage, as a way for later dynasties to anchor themselves in ancient authority. To say our kingship belongs in the chain. Our rule is not new. It descends from what was given before. And if that is the function, then the pre-flood section is not decorative. It is foundational. It is the root, which means the impossibility of the numbers doesn't automatically make them meaningless. It makes them difficult. It makes them resistant. It makes them demand interpretation. So we do what this entire investigation has been doing. We set aside the reflex to dismiss, and we ask what frameworks the text itself permits. One possibility: the numbers are symbolic and idiom for deep antiquity, not meant as biology, but as a way of placing early kings beyond the reach of ordinary time. Another possibility: scribal transmission introduced distortions, but the structure remains meaningful. Another possibility: years are counted differently in the pre-flood period by a system not mapping neatly to our calendar. And then there is the possibility the text itself invites, if we take its premise seriously, that kingship descended from heaven implies not only an institution, but agents. If kingship came down, perhaps kings came down with it. Not as ordinary humans, not as beings bound by our lifespans, but as figures with a status between divine and human. Mesopotamian tradition is not rigid about the boundary between gods and humans. There are semi-divine figures. There are rulers with divine parentage. Gilgamesh, the most famous, is described as 2/3 divine. His mother is a goddess. His attributes exceed the ordinary. His reign sits inside history, but his body sits on the edge of myth. So, if the tradition accepts mixed status for post-flood heroes, it can accept mixed status for pre-flood kings. And if the pre-flood kings were not fully human, if they were installed intermediaries, representatives, agents placed to govern early humanity under direct divine oversight, then long reigns become interpretable without being simple biology. Long reigns become signs of a different category of ruler, a category of ruler belonging to the before the world that ends at the flood. And now the Civil War framework presses in again, because if pre-flood kings were intermediaries under direct divine governance, then they were not neutral. They were embedded in patronage. Cities had patron gods. Eridu is associated with Enki, Nippur with Enlil, Uruk with Inanna, Sippar with Utu, different cities, different divine alignments. So, if divine factions existed, and the text repeatedly suggests they did, then cities could function as power bases for those factions. And kings installed within those cities become more than administrators. They become partisans, representatives, intermediaries tasked with implementing policy. And in a world where the divine assembly is divided, intermediaries would not receive unified directives. They would receive competing directives, competing claims, competing demands for offerings, loyalty, resource allocation. So, the pre-flood world under this reading is not a simple paradise. It is a governed landscape caught inside a divided authority structure. A landscape where kingship is not a human invention, but a tool of governance, a means of control, a way to manage a created servant class through appointed rulers. And then the flood happens, and the king list marks it as absolute rupture. Not just more kings, not just another war, a sweep, a reset, and then kingship descends again, which suggests reinstallation, reconstitution, a second founding, a new arrangement. And notice how the post-flood world in the Atrahasis logic is a compromise world. Humans survive, but under constraints. Mortality becomes policy. Population control becomes mechanism. The old direct relationship between gods and humanity is altered. The old pre-flood regime ends. And what replaces it is something less direct, more mediated, more institutional. Human kings, temples, priesthoods, ritual systems. A governance structure that can maintain control without needing rulers who reign tens of thousands of years. So when the king list's numbers shrink, one interpretation is simple: the scribes drifted toward plausibility. But another interpretation, one the text's own before/after structure invites, is that the change reflects a change in regime, a change in the kind of kingship that exists, a change in how direct governance is, a change in the degree of divine presence. And we do not need to prove that interpretation to see why the text supports the question, because the text itself insists kingship came down. The flood swept over, kingship came down again. A first arrangement, a second arrangement. And the second arrangement is the world we recognize. The world where dynasties are shorter, where reigns are measured in decades, where archaeology can confirm names, where kings build monuments, where institutions function visibly. So the final question emerges not as speculation, but as the natural consequence of reading the tradition as it presents itself. If the pre-flood kingship is described as descending from heaven, and if the flood is described as deliberate policy enacted by a divided assembly, then the flood is not only a disaster, it is a political transition. It is regime change on the largest scale, a forced reset after conflict escalated beyond containment. And now we arrive at the last section of this investigation, the place where the script itself turns from evidence into interpretive choice. Because once you have walked through tablets, councils, symbols, thefts, floods, and kingship, you must ask, how should we read all of it? As myth, as allegory, as preserved memory, and what does each choice demand of us? So we arrive where the text itself arrives. Not at certainty, not at a clean verdict, but at a choice of reading. And even that word choice may feel too modern, too individual, too casual, because the tablets do not present themselves as optional. They present themselves as preserved, as maintained, as carried forward by generations who treated them as worth the effort, worth the clay, worth the copying, worth the storage in libraries, worth the education of scribes, worth the time. So perhaps the better word is not choice, but posture. How do you sit in front of these accounts? How do you hold them? What kind of seriousness do you grant them? Because the evidence we have is not a single story told once. It is a network, a pattern repeated across texts, across cities, across centuries. And that repetition is part of the meaning. We began in a climate-controlled vault beneath London. We began with a tablet that is brittle-scarred, eroded by millennia, yet still legible enough to preserve a core claim. 7 Anunnaki judges sit in judgment. They pronounce sentence. They decree fate. And what struck us first was not the presence of gods. It was the procedural language, the tribunal structure, the sense that authority is exercised through form, through recognized jurisdiction, deliberation, binding decisions. From there, the pattern widened. The gods are not portrayed as a unified harmony. They are portrayed as an assembly that argues, an assembly that forms factions, an assembly whose decisions can be opposed, subverted, contested. Enlil proposes, Enki resists. Symbols of authority, M, E. The tablet of destinies are transferable. They can be granted. They can be stolen. They can be recovered by force. Succession is not gentle. Regime change is not rare. And the flood sits in the center as escalation into policy, a deliberate attempt at erasure, opposed by a rival power, resulting in compromise rather than reconciliation. Then the king list stands beside these narratives with its calm record-like voice. Kingship descended from heaven, reigns measured in impossible spans. Then the flood swept over, then kingship descended again. And the text does not signal that it is switching genres. It does not warn you that you are leaving fiction and entering fact. It simply continues, which forces the question we've been circling the entire time. What did the scribes believe they were doing? Because there is a difference between a culture that preserves stories it knows are invented and a culture that preserves what it believes is foundational truth, truth as history, truth as law, truth as sacred order. We do not have a Sumerian preface explaining in our terms, this is myth. We do not have the modern boundary markers. What we have is the treatment, copying, teaching, preserving, cataloging, integrating into legitimacy. And that treatment suggests the texts mattered in a way that casual fiction rarely matters. So how do we read them? The script itself offers 3 interpretive postures, and it matters that it offers them without collapsing one into another. First posture, pure mythology. Symbolic narratives invented to explain the world, justify social structures, dramatize cosmic order. Under this posture, divine battles represent theological concepts. Flood narratives represent natural catastrophes or moral thinking. Divine assemblies mirror human politics projected onto the heavens. The Anunnaki are literary. The conflicts are devices. The tablets preserve imagination and ideology, not memory. This posture is strong because it requires no beings we cannot verify. It fits the modern academic habit of treating ancient gods as symbolic language for human concerns. And it explains variation between city traditions as political and cultural competition. But it also asks something of us. It asks us to assume that ancient scribes maintained a boundary they never explicitly mark. It asks us to assume they knew which parts were just stories, even as they embedded them into legitimacy frameworks like kingship descent. It asks us to interpret continuity pre-flood and post-flood as literary technique rather than historical posture. That may be true, but it is still an assumption. Second posture, encoded wisdom. Not literal history, not casual fiction, but a symbolic way of preserving deep truths about governance, authority, human nature, the tension between order and flexibility, the dangers of power, the fragility of civilization. Under this posture, Enlil and Enki become principles. Enlil, law, hierarchy, executive order. Enki, wisdom, adaptation, loophole, survival. The flood becomes catastrophe encoded as moral and political lesson. The tablet of destinies becomes legitimacy. ME becomes cultural institutions. The underworld judges become the inescapable jurisdiction of death. This posture is appealing because it honors the sophistication of the texts without demanding literal belief. It allows the tablets to remain true in a philosophical sense. But it also carries a risk. It can become unfalsifiable. Anything can be made to symbolize anything. Interpretation begins to reflect the reader more than the text. And it can still smuggle in the same assumption as pure mythology, that the scribes were consciously crafting allegory without evidence that they framed it that way. Third posture, preserved memory. The most controversial posture, but also the one that takes the texts at their implied face value that the scribes were recording what they believed happened. Not necessarily with modern empirical standards, not necessarily with details that map neatly onto our timeline, but as documentation imperfect, transmitted culturally filtered of real events as their civilization understood them. Under this posture, the Anunnaki are not metaphors. They are actual powers. The assembly is not literary scaffolding. It is governance. The conflicts are not theological abstractions. They are political realities. The flood is not symbol, it is policy. And the post-flood settlement is treaty humanity's existence, maintained by an unstable compromise between factions. This posture explains the procedural emphasis. It explains why the texts sound administrative, where pure myth would normally luxuriate in wonder. It explains why the tradition is obsessed with regalia, decrees, councils, oaths, jurisdiction. It explains why the king list treats impossible reigns as record rather than wink. But it asks something of us too. It asks us to accept the possibility of entities and events we cannot independently verify. It asks us to hold uncertainty without defaulting to dismissal. And it challenges the modern narrative of civilization as purely human invention, unfolding in a straight line. So which posture is correct? The honest answer is the one the script itself returns to again and again. We do not know with certainty. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of the enduring power of these tablets. They are not proof of the Anunnaki as physical beings. They are evidence of what a civilization believed and preserved. Evidence that the origin story they carried was not harmonious, not gentle, not benevolent in the way later traditions prefer. It was administrative, competitive, factional, sometimes brutal, and it cast humanity not as the center of cosmic love, but as a created labor force caught in the crossfire of higher disputes. And now we return finally to the vault. The light is artificial, calibrated to protect clay. The tablet rests in darkness most of the time, brought out only for study. K162, BM78941, CBS 10673, MS 3175. Catalog numbers modern bureaucracy, laid over ancient claims, and yet those claims persist beneath the labels. 7 judges, a stolen tablet, a council decree, a flood as reset, kingship descending, a before and an after. So what does it mean for you listening now? Not in a sensational way, not as a command to believe, but as an invitation to sit with the question the tablets keep refusing to close. If these are myths, why do they sound like governance? If these are allegories, why do they present themselves as continuous history? If these are memories, what kind of reality could generate such a consistent obsession with law? Regalia, councils, and faction. The script cannot answer that for you. It was never going to. Its purpose is not to hand you certainty. Its purpose is to put you in the same posture the ancient scribes put themselves in, a posture of preservation, of repetition, of returning to the same core problem from different angles, because the problem is too large to be held in one pass. And so the closing is not a conclusion. It is a return. The vault is dark. The tablet is silent. But the wedge marks remain. And they keep asking across millennia for the same kind of attention, slow attention, careful attention. Attention that does not rush to dismiss. Attention that does not rush to believe. Attention that can sit quietly with profound uncertainty and still keep reading. Because perhaps that is what these texts were always meant to do, not to end the question, but to keep it alive, to keep it present, to remind us that civilization, even in its own oldest records, did not describe itself as simple. It described itself as inherited, contested, born in conflict, held together by procedure, and always one crisis away from reset. Rest now. Let the images fade, clay in darkness, councils in debate gates, in descent waters, rising kingship descending. And when you return, the question remains unchanged, waiting as it has waited since the first reed stylus pressed wedges into wet earth myth. Allegory, memory. What do you think the scribes believed they were preserving?